So today is January the 3rd, 2023. So we're 3 days into the year, and I haven't, one of the great things about living in a digital age is that you don't have to spend the first month of the year putting the wrong year on your checks as you go through January, because we hardly write a check anymore. So don't have to worry about that. And the time of day, the date of the month, and the month itself is all around you on your smartphones and everything else that you use. So I don't know, I can't remember the last year I had a calendar in my office or hanging up in our house. Our kids used to get us a really neat little desk calendar every year for Christmas, but each month they have kind of a seasonal picture of the grandkids or something on it. And they stopped giving it a few years ago because nobody uses calendars anymore. I just looked at the pictures. I enjoyed looking at the grandkids every day. So we're in a new year. I hope it will be a blessed year for all of you. And we'll ease ourselves back into these end-time studies. This will actually close out the first year tonight because we started last January. These are the first and third Tuesday, but we started on the third Tuesday last year. So tonight kind of closes out an entire year. And this is session number 19. And the two handouts that you have are going to be, well, we used the timeline worksheet, I think all the way back 3 or 4 sessions ago. So we've been using this one for several times. And tonight we're going to be looking at that final column, that timeline worksheet. And that final column will probably be session 19 and 20. Probably take us a couple of sessions to get through that last column. And what this other handout is, that says session 19 and 20, End Times Bible Study handout, is I took all of those verses in that third column, plus some others, and then organized it into 8 key points. So instead of just looking at a whole column of verses and a few words attached to it, they can kind of be a little bit confusing. I took those verses and organized them into separate points. And that's what I want to go over tonight. So I put up on the board for us these anchor points, and we've gone through these Matthew 24 just to kind of remind ourselves where we are. We got to Matthew 24, we got to verse 15. And Jesus said, stop and go to Daniel regarding more details about the abomination of desolation. So the abomination of desolation that happens in the middle of the 7 years is like a key. He said, okay, it's time to stop, go over to Daniel and learn more about it, and then come back to Matthew 24 and you'll understand the rest of the chapter better. To me, that's what he's saying there in 24:15. So that's what we did. And then when we got to Daniel, we learned that in 9:27, on the prophecy of the 70 weeks, it kind of gave us a time order for this 70th week. That one verse, the first part, the middle part, and the last part, takes us all the way through the entire 7 years. So that's where kind of this timeline worksheet page kind of was born out of that. Because as I looked at 9:27, which we have on that timeline worksheet is kind of with the arrows working its way across, is we looked at 9:27, there's 3 separate statements. At the beginning, he shall confirm a covenant, so that starts the 70th week, or the 7 years. And then it goes on to say, but in the middle of the week, He breaks the covenant, sets up the abomination of desolation. So that gets us to the middle, and that kind of anchors us right there to the middle. And then that verse closes in 9:27 by saying, until the consummation. So just for maybe a little closer look, let's go to Daniel 9:27 and look at the layout of that. Read 9:27. And what we're looking at, this will be one of the points down in point number 6. We won't probably get to it tonight. But there are two princes described in this prophecy. And I've always seen it that way, but the more that I've studied the Old Testament prophets, you start seeing it in a lot of places. And it's not always like directly, sometimes kind of veiled, sometimes the phrasing is a little bit indirect. But you start realizing, I'm seeing it again in my daily Bible readings, reading through Isaiah and Jeremiah, and now I'm in Ezekiel. And if you have kind of that mindset of two princes from Daniel 9:25 and 26, you start seeing these little phrases pop up all through the prophets where you realize they're describing these two figures. They're describing this evil figure. At one point it may be called the king of Babylon, or the king of Assyria, king of Greece, the king of the Fourth Empire. Or in other places he's called the Assyrian. Another place is called the Babylonian. So it's not even talking about a king. It's just talking about this figure. And it's always in opposition to God's people and to God's will and to God's Messiah. So I've discovered even more clearly that all through the Old Testament, they're putting these two figures side by side in opposition. And then the clearest revelation, so Daniel comes along after Moses, who deals with it, after Isaiah, after Jeremiah, contemporary with Ezekiel, but then after Ezekiel. So Daniel has this like special insight, gift that God has given him, where he's able to take all those older prophets and then glean from them and summarize them. And I think that's what a lot of Daniel 9:24 through 27 is a summary of his understanding of the previous prophets. For instance, in verse 24, when he says 70 weeks are determined, okay, that tells us a time period, and it tells us a determination by God, a decree by God, that a particular time period is going to be set out in the future. 70 weeks, 70 times 7, 490 years. I've gone over this before, but just to get us kind of back on track. The reason they were in Babylon was that they had missed 70 Sabbath years. 490 years they had not observed the Sabbath year every 7 years. So God took them out of the land. He said, every 7th year you have to let the land rest. And I'll bless you, I'll provide for you. If you have enough faith, I'll take care of you. You're not going to starve. It'll be a reminder every 7 years that I am your God, you are my people, I love you, I will take care of you as a good father does. You don't have to worry, but let your land rest every 7 years. Well, once they got a king, if you time it back, it goes back almost exactly to the time they demanded a king. Samuel told them, okay, God's going to allow it, but this king's going to take your sons and daughters as servants. You're going to have to pay taxes to support him and the palace and his lifestyle. He's going to take your food. He's going to take your animals. He's going to take a lot of your stuff to support being a king and having servants and so on and so forth. He's going to become very wealthy on your backs, which is exactly what happened. So the people, evidently, we're not told directly, but the fact that they quit observing the Sabbath year as soon as they got a king leads us to believe that they concluded we can no longer afford to let the land rest and to observe a Sabbath year. And so God basically said, okay, you rebel, miss 70 Sabbath years, I always get my way. Either through willing submission on your part or through a stronger measure. And the stronger measure was, I'll just remove you from the land for 70 years. I'll get my 70 Sabbath years back all at once. And so we understand for 490 years they had rebelled against that law. So God gets those 70 Sabbath years back by 70 years captivity in Babylon. And then he gives this prophecy, I have a plan for you in the future for 490 years. And that's what this prophecy is about. And then those items listed in verse 24, there's 6 or 7, depends on how you count them, of all that he's going to accomplish during these 490 years. And all of them describe what Christ did in his first coming and will finalize in his second coming. Finish the transgression, make an end of sins, make reconciliation for iniquity, bring in everlasting righteousness, seal up vision and prophecy, to anoint the most holy. That is simply Daniel's rewording, summarizing Jeremiah's new covenant. Jeremiah 31, verses 31 through 34. You go read that, follow the cross references. Ezekiel talks about it. Isaiah talks about it. But Jeremiah is the one who calls it the new covenant in chapter 31, verses 31 through 34. Daniel was the protege of Jeremiah. Jeremiah was his mentor. Therefore, Daniel would know Jeremiah's new covenant details quite well. So it's just a rewording. Verse 24 is a rewording of the details of Jeremiah's new covenant. But it's going to be accomplished through this figure. Which figure? The one in verse 25. Messiah the Prince. So that's the good figure. But after 62 weeks, and there's already been 7 weeks, so 69 weeks, 483 years from a certain starting point, Messiah shall be cut off. There, Daniel borrows language or quotes from another prophet who influenced him greatly. Isaiah chapter 53, a famous chapter about the suffering servant, the death of Christ. Isaiah 53:8 tells us that Messiah shall be cut off. He shall be cut off from the land of the living. He shall be killed. All Daniel is really doing in this prophecy is taking language from previous prophets, kind of reorganizing them, and then this is what comes out. Messiah shall be cut off, but not for himself. He didn't have to die for his own sins, but for the sins of others. And the people of the prince who is to come. There is a prince who will come sometime after Messiah the prince is killed. Or killed. Shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. Many people believe that's Titus in 70 AD, but we believe that it goes way beyond that. There's going to be a final fulfillment of it at the return of Christ. Verse 27 is our timeline. He, the prince to come, shall confirm or make strong. So he doesn't make a new covenant. He confirms a previous new covenant, Jeremiah's new covenant, which is mentioned back in verse 24. Well, how is that covenant confirmed? Well, he lets them rebuild their temple, start their religious practices again, gives them access to the Temple Mount, which seems impossible in our day, but we see it heading that direction. So that's what he makes it for 1 week, so that's the 70th week, the last 7 years. But then we come to the middle of the week. So he agrees to 7 years, but in 3.5 years he decides he no longer wants it to be enforced. So he's going to bring an end to sacrifice and offering. So that's the end of the access to the Temple Mount, the temple, whatever form that will take, and the abomination that makes desolate, the abomination of desolation. So this is where Jesus said in Matthew 24:15, go back to Daniel, find all the places where it's mentioned, study everything in front of it and after it, and then come back to Matthew. So that's what we're doing. And then Daniel 9:27 is kind of what inspired this timeline worksheet. Working out the start of the 7 years, the middle of the 7 years, the end of the 7 years, which in this verse is called even until the consummation. You notice those words, which is determined. That's from God's standpoint. I have determined all this. It is decreed. It's going to happen. It's part of my plan. It's all on a time schedule. And when that time comes, that consummation, which is at the end of this is the 7-year line. This is the whole ages from the time of this age and the age to come. So these are not the same timeline. This is a much larger scale. And so we're living in this age now. I give all the verses that mention that idea, and then we have the age to come, which is the millennial. Revelation 20 mentions it 6 times. What happens to change from this age to the age to come? What changes it? 2 things, which is 2 Thessalonians 2:1. We beseech you, brethren, by the parousia, the coming. Actually, the idea is arrival or presence. We beseech you by 2 things. The parousia of Christ and our gathering together, the episunago. We get it's synagogue with epi in front of it, which intensifies it. Gathered together. So 2 events happen to change from this age to the age to come. And those 2 events happen at the same time. And everything changes. So I do the same thing down here. We've kind of done this before. The 3 parts of Daniel 9 along the 7 years. And then this is where Jesus said, when you see the abomination of desolation, go to Daniel and understand it. And then, so just 4 little words kind of outlines Matthew 24. And 24:21, when you see the abomination of desolation, then there shall be tribulation such as there never was. That's the last 3.5 years. Then we're moving along that timeline. We get to 24:29, immediately after the tribulation. So now we're at the end of 24:21. And then chapter 24, verse 30, then he shall send his angels. They shall gather together. There's that gathering together again of the elect to Christ. So let's look at these 8 key points. The first one, and I have this at the top of the 3rd column, next to the bold word in. Revelation 10:7. So let's go over there. And something often overlooked in Revelation 10:7. So these are the 7 angels sounding the 7 trumpets. Chapter 8 and 9 describe the first 6 trumpets. And kind of like the millennial, the age to come, is set off from the first 6 days. We've gone over this before. From Adam to Christ was 4 days. Christ, from his first coming to his second coming, is 2 days. That's in the book of Hosea. And then the millennial, we describe it as the Sabbath period, or the 7th day. So there's the idea of the 7th being the Sabbath. But so often, you got 6 because that's the number of man, 7 the number of perfection or God or completion. And often they're like set apart from each other. 6 and then 7, kind of like set apart. And that's what you have here. You have the 6 trumpets, chapter 8 and 9. And then it's like it doesn't, you expect to go right into the 7th trumpet, but you don't. It's like, okay, I got to read a bunch of other stuff before we get to this. It actually doesn't sound until 11:15. You skip a long ways until you get back to the 7th trumpet. But God knows that, so he kind of reminds us in 10:7. But in the days, and it's important, that plural idea is, there's something about the 7th trumpet. The other 6 seem to be like a loud, short blast, and then the event happens. The 7th trumpet seems to be a blast that lasts for a while, days. Because a lot happens in the sound of the 7th trumpet. When he is about to sound, the mystery of God will be finished, as he declared to his servants, the prophets. So I said the 7th trumpet sound will be the most important trumpet blast in all of history. How many important trumpet blasts have there been? Andy, you've been in the military. Military history, those of us who love military history. How many empires have been built because of a timely trumpet sound of charge or retreat or bring in the cavalry? I told myself, don't get them mixed up, and I did. Hey, I blame it on COVID. Blame it on China, if I misspeak tonight. Cavalry. But every good military through history always knew what each trumpet sound meant. History has been changed because of timely trumpet sounds. But this trumpet, the 7th trumpet, is the most important trumpet blast in history. In fact, some say it's the most important non-human sound. I have to say non-human because, it is finished when he said on the cross. That's a little bit more important maybe. Or let there be light, so words of God certainly are the most important. But the most important non-human sound of any type in history. Because it's going to usher in an open revelation of the mystery of God should be finished. Brings an end to this age. So the 7th trumpet is the same as the parousia and the episunago. What triggers those events? The sounding of the 7th trumpet. It's the consummation. Daniel 9:27, part C, until the consummation. Everything changes at the sounding of the 7th trumpet. So let's read about it. And I've enjoyed doing this through the years. I'm not going to spend much time on it tonight. I like to talk about the 4 R's of the 7th trumpet. It's just kind of a way a memory device, makes it easier to understand some of the major events that happen sounding the seventh trumpet. 11:15, the seventh angel sounded, and there were loud voices in heaven saying, the kingdoms of this world have become, and you have the kingdoms in italics, simply the kingdom of our Lord and of his Christ, and he shall reign forever and ever. So one of the R's, he's coming back to reign. In order to reign, he has to return, of course. And at his return, there's a resurrection. So the seventh trumpet sounds, he returns, Lucia. There's a resurrection, he gathers together his saints. There's his reign, and there's also mentioned here the reward that he brings with him. So verse 16, the 24 elders who sat before God on their thrones fell on their faces, worshiped God, saying, we give you thanks, O Lord God Almighty, the one who is, who was, who is to come. Because you have taken your great power and reigned. The nations were angry, your wrath has come, the time of the dead that they should be judged, and that you should reward your servants, the prophets and the saints. And those who fear your name, small and great, should destroy those who destroy the earth. So when is the rewarding time of the saints? The sounding of the seventh trumpet. Not some 7 years earlier in some kind of pre-tribulation rapture, where we're told the saints are raptured, go to heaven, there's the marriage, there's the rewarding time, there's rejoicing, they're up there with Christ. We'll take care of that at point 3. I conclude point 1 by saying 11:18, we must conclude, and it happens at the same time, what is mentioned. Your wrath has come, and that you should destroy those who destroy the earth. So God's wrath and destruction on the enemies happen at the same time as his return, the resurrection of the saints, the rewarding of the saints, and the beginning of the reign of Christ. So the 4 R's and the other 2 points, wrath and destroy, they all happen at the seventh trumpet. It's a pretty big deal. I've gone over this, so I won't spend much time on point 2, but the seventh trumpet that accomplishes point 1 is the same as the last trumpet of our resurrection of 1 Corinthians 15, 51 through 55. I would like to point out something there if you turn over to 1 Corinthians 15. One of the things I'm enjoying more than ever, and I think it's because the last number of years I've purposely tried to spend more time in the Old Testament prophets, is you begin to recognize more how the language and phrasing of those Old Testament writers are in the forefront of the New Testament writers, and they're basically saying the same thing. They're quoting. They have in mind particular people of the Old Testament. So when we say in verse 51 of 1 Corinthians 15, behold, I tell you a mystery. We shall not all sleep, but we shall be changed. In a moment, at the twinkling of an eye, at the last trumpet, the trumpet will sound, the dead will be raised incorruptible, and we shall be changed. What did he say twice? We shall be changed. Can you think of an Old Testament famous passage that says the same thing? Job 14:14. If a man dies, shall he live again? All the days of my hard service, I will wait till my change comes. So Job, being one of the earliest books of the Old Testament, we don't know exactly when he lived, maybe around the time of Abraham, maybe even a little before, but way back there, And already, godly people were calling the resurrection their change. And it's easy to understand. Change from a mortal body to an immortal body. Do you think Saul of Tarsus at the feet of Gamaliel knew the language of the Old Testament as well or better than maybe anybody? Maybe anybody ever. I don't know. Do you think, and again, I have to say this because people get the wrong ideas. I know it's inspiration. I know the Spirit is directing him to write this. But the Spirit is directing him to write what's already in his mind. That the resurrection is called a change. He already knew that growing up. And so the Spirit is allowing him to use the exact same language as Job used. So the seventh trumpet that accomplishes point 1 is the same as the last trumpet of our resurrection, 1 Corinthians 15, which is the same as the trumpet of God, 1 Thessalonians 4:16, which also mentions the shout of Christ, the voice of Christ and of the archangel. And the same trumpet as the post-tribulation, a great sound of a trumpet, Matthew 24:31, which is a direct quote from Isaiah 27:13, where he uses the definite article because it's a particular trumpet that they seem to all know about. They all seem to know about this seventh trumpet a long time before Revelation, where he says the great trumpet will be blown. And that verse goes on to say that that's the time people will come to Jerusalem to worship the King. That's during the Millennial. What starts that process? The great sound, the great trumpet will be blown. So Jesus is just quoting Isaiah. Why is Jesus quoting Isaiah? Well, who told Isaiah to write what he wrote? Jesus did. So why did Jesus tell us to stop and go to Daniel to learn more about the abomination of desolation? Because you read all through those prophecies and visions, and then the interpretation of them is given to Daniel by who? Gabriel, mostly. Other angels, occasionally. What is an angel? A messenger. Who gives him the message to go carry to somebody on the earth? Jesus does. So Jesus was telling Gabriel, I want you to tell Daniel all these things about the abomination of desolation. So when Jesus says in Matthew 24:15, regarding this event, go to Daniel. Why? Because I already sent Gabriel to tell him all that stuff. So I don't need to repeat it here. And Daniel's an inspired book of the Bible. So, I sent Gabriel to give him that message 600 years ago. So go back and read it. Then come back to Matthew. Point 3, this is the fulfillment. I like this one. So let's turn to Revelation 6. I fellowship with many good, godly people who hold to a pre-tribulation rapture. So certainly don't make it a test of fellowship. But the more I study eschatology and the more I study a passage like this, I can't get anywhere near that belief. So in Revelation 6, verse 9, when he opened the fifth seal, so we're way into the tribulation, I saw under the altar the souls of those who had been slain for the word of God and for the testimony which they held. In the tribulation, I think is the idea. I think this is when they were slain for the word of God and for the testimony that they held. Keep your finger there, because he's simply describing people go to 12:11 of Revelation. And they, saints, overcame him, Antichrist, by the blood of the Lamb, by the word of their testimony. They did not love their lives to the death. These are clearly people being killed in the tribulation during the time of Antichrist. All I think chapter 6, verse 9 is talking about very similar wording. They'd been slain for the word of God and for the testimony that they held. It's just talking about and people who were killed earlier in chapter 12, verse 11. There's ongoing martyrdom all the way through. And those who had been martyred during the tribulation, they're up in heaven under the altar. Do you see any kind of marriage celebration taking place? On the contrary, they cried with a loud voice. This is anguish, or at least this is serious. This is not happy. Let us be glad and rejoice, for the marriage of the Lamb has come. This is not this here. This is the opposite kind of emotion. They cried with a loud voice, saying, "How long, O Lord, holy and true, until you judge and avenge our blood on those who dwell in the earth?" And a white robe was given to each of them, and it was said to them that they should rest a little while longer. So I say the seventh trumpet is the fulfillment of a little while longer. Until, one of those important and famous untils, until both the number of their fellow servants. So you have this group in heaven going through a marriage celebration, rejoicing. Or do you have a bunch of martyred saints crying out, "How long until you avenge our blood?" And the answer is, until both the number of their fellow servants and their brethren who would be killed as they were. So that's why I think it's all of the same group during the same tribulation time. Just some had already been killed. My point is, it's not the language of a marriage celebration taking place in heaven. It's a picture of saints knowing what they had gone through in their own martyrdom. They know that their fellow servants and brethren are facing the same thing on earth, and they're crying out to God for mercy. How much longer till you avenge our blood? There's no time for a celebration yet. And as I like to say, the idea of a group of saints in heaven rejoicing, being rewarded, being married to Christ, while the last part of verse 11 is taking place, their fellow servants and their brethren are being slaughtered on the earth. Those two don't go together. There's no place in the Bible that you can put those two things together at the same time. So, the question would be, does the Bible describe an escape through an exit from tribulation, or does it describe endurance through tribulation? Exit or endurance? And I know, and the more I study this, and I study others around the world who are studying these same subjects, and many of them who travel around the world and minister to Christians around the world, one of the things they are almost shocked at first about, and they come back to America and they say, it's really only in America. the West in general, but especially America, that this idea that God would not allow us to go through tribulation, and His plan is for us to escape it through an exit. In other countries where Christians, especially Muslim countries in China and places like that, where Christians are being killed all the time, they don't have this mindset of God's plan is escape from tribulation. They have a mindset of God's plan is endurance through tribulation. It's really mainly an American thing. And it's pretty strong in America, but that's one of the things that's one of the setbacks or problems, I think, of the long prosperity and blessings upon America, is it develops this mindset of, as I've heard many people say, if God allows His church to go through the tribulation, that is, He is allowing spousal abuse. So I immediately always have two thoughts. All the saints that have been slaughtered through history, was that spousal abuse? Because they're qualified for the bride. They're the bride too. They got slaughtered. And the old thing of, does He love the saints He raptures more than the saints that come up during the tribulation that get slaughtered? I mean, if it's spousal abuse, why doesn't He rapture them the moment they're saved during the tribulation, or the moment they're back, whatever? But the moment they become His, why doesn't He rapture them then? Because if His plan is for us to escape all that. No, plenty of places in Revelation where He lets His saints go through it and be killed. So I don't think it should be any different. I'll close on point 4. The parousia, the coming, arrival, presence of Christ. So let's turn to 2 Thessalonians 2:1. This has become my new favorite in my mind, and I'm sure those who hold a different position would have a comeback to it of some type. This is my new favorite, what I call shortest proof, defense maybe, against a pre-tribulation rapture, or proof of a post-tribulation single resurrection at the return of Christ. No two phases, no two parts, nothing separated by 7 years or anything like that. I think the easiest way to show it, and you don't have to use the Greek words, but sometimes it's good. They're simple words. You kind of explain it a little bit. Parousia means arrival or coming. Presence is a good word for it. The parousia of 2:1 is the same parousia as 2:8. Now, does that make sense? There's a coming of Jesus, parousia, in 2:1. And that same word, parousia, coming, is used in 2:8 of the destruction of the Antichrist. The Lord will consume with the breath of His mouth and destroy with the brightness of His parousia. Now, the same writer, writing to the same church about the same subject, about the same time period, uses the same Greek word, parousia. It says, the parousia of Jesus to gather His saints to Him, in verse 1, is the same parousia of Him destroying the Antichrist. They both happen at the same time. It's the same parousia, the same coming. So that's one way. So that's using two verses. And then the gathering together to Him is this word episunago, or episunagage, whether, the noun or verb. The episunago in verse 1, that happens at the parousia of Christ, that also is the parousia that destroys the Antichrist, is the same episunago of Matthew 24:31. Yeah, I have it here. Where immediately after the tribulation, he sends out his angels to gather together his elect. Again, using the same Greek word. So I use two Greek words. You don't have to get too fancy about it. And just place them in time. Two places parousia is used, in 2:1 and 2:8, accomplishing two totally different events, but at the same parousia. At this parousia, he gathers his saints to him in 2:1. Matthew 24:31 uses the same word, gathered together, but it happens immediately after the tribulation. So in my mind, and I know somebody well-versed with a different view would have maybe a decent answer to this, but in 3 verses, 2 Thessalonians 2:1, 2 Thessalonians 2:8, Matthew 24:31. If you can connect the coming and the gathering together in those 3 verses. As I told someone recently, the more detailed I get into the subject of eschatology, it's kind of weird what happens. As you're trying to deal with a lot of detailed, complex subjects, you're all over the Bible, you're trying to put them together like pieces of a 10,000-piece puzzle, it seems like sometimes. So you got all this information, you're trying to fit it all together. But what is happening is, in the back of my mind, the Lord's using all that to say, by doing this, going through this detailed, long process, you're not making the subject more complicated, you're making it more simple. To where you're able to take 3 verses, kind of put it all together to say these 3 verses only allow for one conclusion. So, anyway, that's through point 4. We'll go through the next 4 next time because my time is up. So we'll stop our recordings, open it up for discussion. There we go. Let me turn off my clock so it doesn't buzz me.